to introduce our Goodspeed lecturer, Dr. Grace Gao. Dr. Grace Gao is a professor of ethics, the inaugural Sano Chair in Pacific and Asian American Theology, and a founding co-director of the Center for Sexuality, Gender, and Religion at Claremont School of Theology. In addition to her latest publication, she is the author or co-editor of 3 other books, including Encountering the Sacred, Feminist Reflections on Women's Life, Asian American Christian Ethics, and Grounding Human Rights in a Pluralist World. For the past 2 decades, Dr. Gao has been writing, teaching, and speaking about assorted topics in feminism, progressive Christianity, human rights and animal relations, Asian America, and religion in politics in the United States to diverse audiences. She's a second-generation Taiwanese American with degrees in philosophy and religious studies from Stanford University and in religion at Harvard University, who now lives in Southern California with her family. Please welcome her with big hands.
Thank you, Dr. Pei. It's an honor to be here tonight. I have enjoyed every step of my visit so far, from the very nice Granville Inn to lunch and meeting with students and faculty, teaching or guest teaching in Dr. Pei's class, and now this lecture tonight. So thank you for taking time out of your schedules to hear what I have to say. So I'd like to begin with 2 personal anecdotes in reverse chronological order, adapted from chapter 3 and the intro of my book. So anecdote number 1. It was very late one fall evening. I had already been in the hospital for 36 hours and counting after having been admitted for a medically indicated induction. My husband had stationed himself behind my head, gently whispering words of reassurance. He could sense my alarm at how much my body was involuntarily shivering and shaking from the epidural, IV fluids, and labor hormones. Katie, my friend and intended mother of the baby I had been caring for 38.5 weeks, was standing to my left, nervously awaiting what was to unfold. Her husband, Stephen, had not been permitted in the operating room given the 2-guest limit. I could see in front of me a large curtain and several doctors and nurses scurrying about in surgical scrubs and masks. While months before, I had nearly spit out my drink during office hours when a male graduate student recited John 15:13 to me upon hearing of my surrogacy, and then compared me to Jesus. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. It wasn't lost on me that I was now lying down on a T-shaped operating table with my arms outstretched and strapped down in what some nurses have called the crucifix position. Of the many memories I have of the events surrounding my emergency C-section, one stands out above the rest. The moment when my OB-GYN pulled out the baby and we all heard her cry. I remember closing my eyes, releasing a fresh surge of tears from relief, joy, and exhaustion, and thinking silently to myself, hot damn, we did this. I also remember sensing my doctor's hesitation as he held the baby girl and slowly moved toward me. He seemed uncertain, or perhaps he had simply forgotten to whom he should give her, my friend Katie or me, her surrogate. So I quickly exclaimed, Katie, give the baby to Katie, and then uncharacteristically stammered, Katie, hold your baby, to end his confusion by barking out orders of what was to be done. As my unconventional pregnancy came to an end, so did Katie and Stephen's 10-year saga of involuntary childlessness. Okay, anecdote number 2. In the waning weeks of my third pregnancy, when my shape, even under billowy summer dresses, served as a telltale sign of my condition, I could no longer run into an acquaintance, colleague, or student without having an exchange that went something like this. "Wow, Grace," or Dr. Gao, "I didn't know you were pregnant. When are you due?" "October 1st. "Congrats. Do you know what you're having?" "Thanks. Yes, it's a girl. But here's the thing, I'm actually carrying my friend's baby, not my own." The eyes of whomever I was talking to would usually then widen with shock. After all, I was 40 years old at that time and a married, middle-class Taiwanese American tenured professor with 2 kids. Hardly the stereotype of someone who becomes pregnant for others. How my conversation partners would then respond would vary. Most would pay me some sort of compliment. "How generous of you. That's amazing. What a gift." Others would struggle to process what they've just heard. "You mean you're a surrogate?" I could tell most were also curious about whether the baby was genetically mine or how our unusual arrangement came to be. Many of my women interlocutors would first register surprise like the others, and then imaginatively place themselves in a parallel position. They would blurt out, "Wow, I could never do that," before narrating how difficult their pregnancy, labor and delivery, or postpartum experiences had been, or why they couldn't imagine undergoing all of that to birth a child into the world for someone else. Through these exchanges, I even came to learn something I hadn't known previously, how surrogacy had been a live option for some people I knew. 4 women disclosed to me that they too had once contemplated carrying a child for a loved one, but didn't go through with it for one reason or another. 2 others had considered surrogacy in their own long route to parenthood. A good friend with a school-age child and a sad history of miscarriages reacted to my news in partial jest. "Grace, I didn't know you were available." One of my older son's coaches exclaimed, "Why couldn't we have met you 4 years ago when we needed you?" Before recounting the ordeal his wife and he had endured of several rounds of IVF and multiple miscarriages before adopting their daughter overseas. My visibly pregnant body and one sentence mention of my carrying a baby for my friends had been enough to induct me into a society that I had scarcely known existed. It was one where fertility problems were freely told and shared, and where people found themselves strangely moved, even flooded with tears upon hearing the scantest of details about our story. Years later, I came to understand that these reactions were par for the course. As Elizabeth Kane, America's first contractually paid surrogate mother, came to see, infertility isn't exactly cocktail party talk, but as soon as anyone finds out the details of my pregnancy, they feel free to tell me the most intimate details of their lives. So I have the great honor of speaking to you tonight as your Goodspeed lecturer because of my firsthand experiences with and scholarly reflections on a controversial topic. Surrogacy as a way of bringing a child into the world is generally not something people feel indifferent about. Some folks marvel at what modern medicine makes possible, while others are aghast at this use of science to, quote, play God. Some people lavish praise on persons like me who become pregnant for others out of a desire to help them, while others feel pity and revulsion for anyone who would perform such a metaphorical and literal labor for money. Some people sympathize with couples who cannot bear children of their own, while others judge them harshly for commissioning women to endure such significant health risks on their behalf, when in those critics' minds, such couples should just adopt. When I ask my students what comes to mind when they think of surrogacy, many will immediately rattle off celebrities who have gone this route. This growing list includes models Tyra Banks and Chrissy Teigen, singers Elton John and Ricky Martin, actresses Lucy Liu, Angela Bassett, Gabrielle Union, and Rebel Wilson, reality TV stars Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton, talk show hosts Jimmy Fallon and Andy Cohen, broadcast journalists Anderson Cooper, and soccer superstar Cristiano Ronaldo. Others just as quickly describe dystopian nightmares of an underclass of breeders forced to gestate the offspring of the elite, such as in novelist Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. This is a 1985 book and classic, and the book's adaptation into an Emmy Award-winning TV series. Legally, to be sure, the matter is a minefield. Surrogacy of any kind is prohibited in 3 states in the US and in several countries across the world, including Germany, Sweden, Italy, and Spain. Other countries only permit non-commercial surrogacy arrangements and have stringent requirements for eligibility, and a legal vacuum exists in still other countries. This variability of laws and customs, not to mention total costs, has led to the rise of a multi-billion-dollar global infertility industry where destination hotspots rise and fall according to changes in public policies, natural disasters, and war. For the record, California, where I'm from, is largely considered the surrogacy capital of the world, given its permissive laws, tolerant social attitudes about diverse family types, and ample fertility clinics and surrogacy agencies, including several that cater to very niche clientele like gay male couples and Mandarin-speaking foreign nationals from the Pacific Rim. When I first agreed some 8 years ago to care of my friend's baby, I certainly wasn't thinking that I'd get a book deal out of it, much less embark on a research agenda that would preoccupy me for the next several years. But I quickly came to see that there was both considerable interest in and widespread misperceptions about this practice. And at the encouragement of several colleagues and friends, I started to commit to researching and writing about it. So as someone who identifies as a feminist ethicist and a progressive Christian, I wrote my book in a way that engages those who are feminist but not necessarily Christian, those who are Christian but not necessarily feminist, and those who, like me, claim both sets of identities and commitments. As a work of Christian ethics, I ground my framework of 7 norms and principles to guide the formation of ethical surrogacy relationships in the 4 traditional sources of Christian ethics. This is Bible, tradition, reason, and secular sources of knowledge and experience, The reason or secular sources of knowledge I turn to include international human rights standards, professional medical societies' ethics committee opinions on assisted reproduction, and the reproductive justice framework founded by Black activists in the mid-1990s and developed further by a broader coalition of women of color. And the experiences I draw upon include my own and the reproductive journeys of other so-called surrogacy triads, as documented in approximately 4 decades of ethnographic and social scientific studies. Other women who have become pregnant for others, other parent hopefuls who have opted for this medical technique after considering all possible avenues to parenthood, and the surrogate-born children themselves. Because I cannot possibly compress the argument of my book into one 45-minute lecture with Q&A, and because I have titled my talk, Is Surrogacy a Bad Idea for Women?, I want to especially focus on this 4th source of moral wisdom, experience. Following the work of philosophers L.A. Paul and Fiona Woolard, certain kinds of lived experiences, namely those of surrogates like me and others who have had at least one pregnancy resulting in a live birth, which is a common prerequisite for surrogate motherhood. Following the work of philosophers L.A. Paul and Fiona Woolard, I am arguing that certain kinds of lived experiences, namely those of former surrogates like me and others who have had at least one pregnancy resulting in a live birth, and this is a common prerequisite to be a surrogate mother, that these experiences should be regarded as epistemically transformative, and thus they should carry greater normative weight in applied ethical debates involving pregnancy, including any pregnancies undertaken for others. So in taking seriously women's firsthand experiences with surrogacy, I invite anyone ambivalent or opposed to the practice to actually listen to the stories of those who have entered into these reproductive agreements for others. And let me just pause here to note that there are more than women who are capable of pregnancy. There are trans men who can become pregnant, but there are no documented cases of non-women becoming surrogates. So I will mostly speak of surrogates using, the term women, but in the book I actually oscillate between pregnancy-capable persons and women. Okay, so is surrogacy bad for women from the perspective of those who perform this service or labor? So tonight I'll cover 3 primary reasons why some have said yes. So some have said, yes, it's bad for women because there is psychological distress. Others have said there are potentially troubling implications for the abortion debate. These are critics from the left, so I'll cover that. And a third group, both on the right and the left, will say that surrogacy impermissibly commodifies and exploits. Okay, so let's start with the first one. When I served as Katie and Stephen's surrogate, hands down the most common question asked of me by friends, colleagues, and strangers alike was a variation of the following. Aren't you afraid you'll grow attached to the baby and not want to give it up? Even the intended mother, Katie, gently asked me versions of this question before, during, and in the weeks after our collaborative reproduction, as she was understandably baffled by my, or any other women in my place, not wanting to keep the baby in the end due to her own intense longing for a child. And today when I spoke in Dr. Pay's class, that was actually the first question that was asked to me. What happens if the surrogate changes her mind, wants to keep the baby, what happens? Okay. So in the postpartum period, and literally for years after, some people would continue to ask whether it was painful for me to continue to see the child I bore being raised by someone else. And they were always shocked when I would tell them no. The working assumption here is that either the handover will prove instantly traumatizing because any birth mom would have grown attached to the baby she has nurtured in her womb, or that surrogates would eventually come to feel tremendous loss about it in the long term after her immediate feelings of joy and satisfaction at the completion of their service would subside. So what accounts for this widespread belief in deep surrogate pain? One factor must be the pervasive belief in the maternal instinct purportedly present in all women, or at least all expectant ones. The understanding that women naturally crave motherhood and will inevitably bond with the life growing inside of them when pregnant. Just as popular culture commonly characterizes birth mothers in adoption as grieving mightily and for a prolonged time after being compelled by tragic circumstances to give up their child, so it is widely assumed surromoms would analogously yearn for the baby they once nurtured in their wombs, but had to give up because of their contracts or their prior agreements with others. I suspect, and this is a little bit more controversial, that just as women who have had abortions are commonly depicted as having made an agonizing decision, even by those who wholeheartedly affirm their legal and moral right to have done so, so it is presumed that anyone who agrees to become pregnant for others could only sever their bond with the baby, which began in utero with great hardship. That the first well-publicized surrogacy cases in the US and the UK ended tragically at a time when the public was first becoming aware of this simultaneously age-old and newer way of bringing children to the world has further sealed in the public imaginary this belief of motherhood as the commonly desired goal of any pregnancy. The first paid traditional surrogate in the US, Elizabeth Kane, originally touted the joys of surrogacy for infertile couples on the talk show circuit. She went on Phil Donahue and all the popular shows then, but later came to regret having served as, in her words, a human incubator, and fell into a deep depression with suicidal ideation that lasted for several months. In the mid-1980s, the world also witnessed traditional surrogate Mary Beth Whitehead's anguished inability to cope following the birth and handover of baby M. Though she had contractually agreed to be inseminated with Mr. William Stern's sperm, and then to relinquish all parental rights for an exchange of $10,000, she did have a change of heart soon after childbirth. She then fled the state with the baby and sought to return the money while suing for custody. And here I'll say there was traumatic and tremendous legal fallout from that, and it extended far beyond the state of New Jersey. Across the Atlantic, the first traditional surrogate in the UK, a woman by the name of Kim Cotton, was similarly devastated because she never got to meet the Swedish couple she was recruited to assist. Now, her arrangement had been brokered by a US agency, and they remained anonymous to her. And because she had agreed never to contact baby Cotton post-birth. The media headlines about her suffering led to public outcry. It also quickly spurred the Surrogacy Arrangements Act of 1985, this is again in the UK, and subsequent laws in the UK, which render contracts unenforceable and permit surrogates to change their mind insofar as every birth mother remains the legal one until and unless a court issues a post-birth parental order to someone else if they believe it to be in their child's best interests. Okay, so popular culture has also reinforced this trope of surrogate grief. To provide two examples, I remember watching a story arc in the hit NBC sitcom Friends, that's been in the news because of Matthew Perry's tragic death, when one of the main characters, Phoebe, played by actress Lisa Kudrow, carries triplets for her brother and his wife. In the 100th episode, when Phoebe gives birth, she asks her brother if she can keep one of them. After he declines, Phoebe shares a moment with the triplets and says the following: "Everyone said labor was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do. However, they were wrong." So more recently, a 2017 best-selling book, Celeste Ng's Little Fires Everywhere, which was adapted for a TV miniseries in 2020, contains a surrogacy gone wrong plot twist. It turns out that one of the two protagonists, Mia Warren, who was played by actress Kerry Washington, was once a traditional surrogate who couldn't bear the thought of parting with the baby once born. So she lied to the couple that she had miscarried and has been raising her daughter Pearl on the lam ever since. Okay, so legal precedents, popular culture. So, do surrogacy arrangements usually come at a high psychological cost for women? In contrast to those early tragic court cases and fictional storylines about traumatic relinquishment, statistics reveal that the vast majority of persons who bear children for others hand the babies over without incident. Medical anthropologist Ellie Tiemann estimates that over 99% of 25,000 surrogates and counting in the US since the late 1970s have gladly handed over the child, with less than 0.1% of cases ending up in court battles. Childlessness overcome through surrogacy, COTS, the oldest UK surrogacy charity founded in 1988 by the aforementioned Kim Cotton, estimates approximately 99% of the arrangements they have facilitated have reached successful conclusions, with COTS being directly involved in over 1,000 surrogate births that have brought unbounded joy to IPs and a great deal of satisfaction to the women who carried their babies. To date, in Canada, there has never been a gestational arrangement contested in court by a surrogate since the nation began regulating surrogacy in 2004. That there have been 6 cases where intended parents did abandon their surrogate during her pregnancy. Usually it's because they had divorced in the interim, and the child ended up being adopted by someone else, not the surrogate mother. So it is not simply that most surrogates follow through with their contractual obligations or preconception agreements. It is that the overwhelming majority give the baby back at journey's end with great delight. A 2021 review essay published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology found that the majority of research aimed at exploring surrogates' coping mechanisms during the relinquishment period unequivocally show feelings of joy, accomplishment, pride, and satisfaction. Most of the surrogates in Heather Jacobson's U.S. study even identified the specific moment of transfer as a highlight and the very reason they engage in surrogacy, since they finally got to witness the making of parents and be recognized for the important role that they had played in that process. A researcher who has conducted fieldwork in Thailand between 2010 and 2018 and in Cambodia in 2015 has concluded similarly. When surrogacy takes place on good terms, an intimate relationship is engendered between the client and surrogate mother, and the altruistic aspirations of the surrogate mother are realized. That surrogates typically part with the baby with relief and gladness, as I did, not torment, not only comes as a surprise to the people with whom I have shared my post-childbirth feelings, but also to some surrogacy researchers themselves. For instance, it was a, quote, unexpected finding for sociologist Hazel Baslington that the majority of surrogates in her study had, quote, coped very well. Though opponents and others ambivalent about the practice worry that surrogacy may be asking too much of a woman to alienate herself from what she would naturally feel toward any child carried in her womb, countless surrogate mothers, including me, report never bonding with the child to begin with, so never needing to protect themselves from becoming attached. As 4 different surromoms from 4 different studies conducted in Israel, the US, and Thailand explain, here it is. It's not mine, and that is why I didn't have the kind of feelings you'd expect. I have no feelings of mother toward her. I do not in any way feel like I'm giving up my child. I'm giving a child to her parents after 9 months of helping to grow. Here's another passage. I nurtured, loved, and would have died for my surrogate baby. It was one of the best experiences of my life. I did, however, have to remind tons of people that I simply gave the baby back to its parents, not away. I cried tears of joy because sacrificing, giving life was more rewarding than I ever thought it would be. And this is all caps, this is in the original, but I still felt nothing maternal whatsoever to that baby I brought into the world. Again, emphasis in the original. Final passage. I knew carrying babies that were not genetically related to me, I would not have a hard time separating. I never felt like I was giving up babies, I was giving them back. If it were genetically mine, I might have felt like I was giving it up. Okay, so finally, it's worth noting that the literature shows that surromoms are more likely to bond with the intended parents instead of the baby. As British psychologist Olja B.A. van der Akker has seen in her clinical studies on families expanded by surrogacy, and this is the passage here, many surrogates and commissioning couples develop a strong bond or friendship during the arrangement because both physical and emotional changes are relevant to both parties. Many experience strong emotions when the result of the pregnancy test is positive and experience of birth is shared. These emotions are shared by both parties together under these intimate conditions. They therefore get to know each other well and must keep in contact well after the arrangement has terminated. Finally, in Hibino and Shimzazono's study of Thai surrogates, their subjects expected that their compassion in helping an infertile couple would be reciprocated not only by monetary payment, but by special treatment during pregnancy after the delivery. In other words, the surrogates understood themselves to be forging a lasting personal relationship with the couple. Thus, when things go wrong from the surrogate's perspective, it is usually due to the tension or strain in the relationship with the intended parents for a variety of possible reasons. For example, while surrogates are usually sympathetic to their IP's desire to exert some control in a long process with no guarantees, some also resent being grilled about their diet, weight gain, work, or other activities. As one 5-time mom and 2-time surrogate, annoyed at her intended mother's presumed expertise, explained, "I don't need someone to tell me how to be pregnant. This isn't my first rodeo. It sounds kind of harsh to say, but you see these IPs who are micromanaging us, and they've never had any kids." Another possible negative outcome is hurt when the feelings of intimacy and closeness with their IPs abate at journey's end. While many parents send regular updates about their new lives with their baby, and many other IP surrogate pairs maintain lasting friendships, particularly in contexts where friendship is expected, there are also sporadic anguish stories of parents who abruptly wean themselves off from their previously chummy relationship, leaving the women who bore their children heartbroken. To sum up this portion, the danger in insisting upon this trope of surrogate pain post-relinquishment, after numerous studies have found it to be the rare exception, not the norm, is that we risk eclipsing the meaning of the process for surrogates themselves. We risk substituting our own preconceived notions of what surrogacy is like for surrogates instead of listening to their first-hand accounts of their own feelings and experiences. Okay, so let's move on to number 2. A second fear that some critics have is that the signing of surrogacy contracts would lead to a curtailing of the surrogate's rights. When reflecting on baby M, feminist Katha Pollitt noted the way surrogacy could erode women's power and autonomy. And this is this passage here. Right now, a man cannot legally control the conduct of a woman pregnant by him. He cannot force her to have an abortion or not have one, to manage her pregnancy and delivery as he thinks best, or to submit to fetal surgery or a C-section. Nor can he sue her if, though what he considers to be negligence, she miscarries or produces a defective baby. A maternity contract could give a man all of these powers, except possibly the power to compel abortion. So she said this in the 1980s in reaction to baby M. But more recently, Gloria Steinem, feminist icon, second waver, voiced very similar concerns in her open letter in June 2019, when she called upon the governor of New York not to legalize commercial surrogacy, since in her open letter she said it undermines women's control over their own bodies when the rights over the fetus that the women are carrying are greatly curtailed, and they, quote, lose all rights to the baby. So just for the record, she was not successful. New York, after decades of prohibition, now allows for paid commercial surrogacy. And that became effective February 15th, 2021. As feminist movement leader Phyllis Chesler explains, again, these are the feminist fears about eroding bodily integrity and having unsavory implications for the abortion debate. Viewing a woman as merely a vessel for property that contractually belongs to intended parents erodes and is in direct conflict with the grounds for a woman's right to an abortion. The embryo/fetus/developing child is part of the woman. It belongs to her because it is her body. This fact gives her the right to terminate a pregnancy. If others, the surrogacy profiteer, the sperm or egg donor, claim this right, then what is to stop the state or the church from making this same claim? So again, that's the fear. And so now the question is, how does someone respond to these concerns that the institution of surrogacy undermines the theoretical basis of abortion rights? So I would say that in an era where there is neither the full realization of reproductive justice nor the security of an individual's rights to pregnancy termination, we should first acknowledge that these fears are not unwarranted. We should thus insist upon securing certain safeguards, particularly the legal right for all pregnant persons to retain medical decision-making in all aspects of their prenatal care. And so that will include termination or selective reduction questions, even when they undertake pregnancies ostensibly for others. Just as a person cannot and should not be legally compelled to donate an organ, blood, or any other part of their body upon their death to save another person's life, even in a hypothetical scenario where no one else could be a match, so a pregnant person cannot and should not be legally coerced to carry out a pregnancy. In short, all parties must remember that in cases of real or potential conflict about managing, continuing on, or terminating a surrogate pregnancy, the ultimate moral and legal decision-making prerogative must rest with the pregnant person, not the intended parents. The reproductive justice framework denounces a coerced abortion or coerced fetal reduction just as much as it decries a coerced pregnancy under its core human rights commitment for every person to decide whether to have a child or whether not to have a child. As philosophers Ruth Walker and Liesl Van Zyl eloquently have explained the matter, the right to decide whether to terminate a pregnancy does not depend on a genetic relationship between mother and fetus, nor is it based on the intention or duty to raise that child. Rather, it is grounded in the right to bodily integrity. Hence, in non-surrogate pregnancies, a woman's spouse or partner does not have a right to demand or prevent abortion, even if he is the genetic and would-be social parent. In the same way, the surrogate's right to decide whether to undergo an abortion is based on her status as a pregnant woman, regardless of the genetic or intended social relationship to the fetus. So, as the American Society for Reproductive Medicine instructs, all parties to a collaborative reproduction should receive counseling about the surrogate's right to make choices for her body. In a clinical context, knowledge that the locus of medical decision-making resides with the surrogate should prevent doctors from incorrectly looking for input from the intended parents when medical decisions are being made during pregnancy, labor, or delivery. While the persons involved should talk through as many foreseeable scenarios as possible and document the mutual understanding in their signed preconception agreements or contracts, only the pregnant person, the true patient in every pregnancy, should be recognized as the party ultimately responsible for determining the course of her prenatal care. Now, it is worth noting that some jurisdictions do have provisions specifically protecting each surrogate's right to handle matters pertaining to selective reduction or pregnancy termination. Now, when the law is unclear, clauses in surrogacy contracts covering selective reduction or pregnancy termination in the U.S. have not generally been interpreted as legally enforceable. Judith Darr, the chairman of the ASRM Ethics Committee, and she's also the dean of College of Law at Northern Kentucky University, she acknowledges the existence of a legal gray area in this matter. But she does not believe a U.S. court would ever direct a surrogate to undergo the procedure without her consent. Even as some reproductive law attorneys continue to insert abortion clauses into these contracts, so for instance, mine did have an abortion clause, Most understand that a remedy for breach, if any, would rest in monetary damages rather than specific performance. Okay, so now let's move to number 3. Okay, we good. All right. Arguably the most widely held suspicion why surrogacy is bad for women is that the industry has created the very conditions for more affluent couples to induce and therein exploit poorer and less educated pregnancy-capable persons to undertake significant medical and psychological risks on their behalf. As buttressed by those tragic landmark cases in the 1980s and popular culture, the public generally believes that no one would willingly become pregnant with a perfect stranger by either artificial insemination or the more cumbersome IVF, heterologous embryo transfer, IVF HET procedure, and then give up the child unless they were pathological or desperate for money. Some opponents of commercial surrogacy bundle their consternation about class with race, particularly when they assume the parent hopefuls would be primarily white or from developed Western countries, and the persons they hire would be disproportionately of color or from the global South. After noting the ways in which the concept of surrogacy, of a person or group taking on the responsibilities that belong to someone else, has been a negative force in African American women's lives throughout all of U.S. history, from slavery up to the present time, pioneering womanist theologian Dolores Williams expressed fears that reproductive surrogacy would inflame already tense race relations. In her words, will the law legitimate surrogacy to the point that Black women's ovaries are targeted for use by groups more powerful than poor Black women? Will surrogacy become such a common practice in wealthy women's experiences that laws are established to regulate it? Laws that work to the advantage of the wealthy and the disadvantage of the poor? Will poverty pressure poor Black women to rent their bodies out as incubators for wealthier women unable to birth children? Are American women stepping into an age of reproductive control so rigid that women will be set against each other like Hagar and Sarah? Will the operations of certain reproductive technologies acting in white women's favor put even more strain upon the already strained relation between Black and white women? So again, she said this in her book, and there have been many people who have echoed these concerns. Let me stay here for a second. Okay. Of course, one way to address the charge of exploitation would be for surrogates to receive more compensation for their efforts. To wit, when labor activists decry abuses in the workplace and campaign for better working conditions, chief among their demands are higher wages. With surrogacy, however, many opponents are not primarily incensed about individuals being underpaid in their reproductive labor. Rather, they find problematic the matter of payment being introduced at all into the equation. Thus, their deeper issue is with commodification, the treatment of pregnancy, parental rights, or children as fungible goods that can be bought and sold, such that persons who agree to become pregnant for others for pay become transformed into baby machines, or some have said reproductive prostitutes. So this combined commodification and exploitation charge is the view held by the European Parliament. Since passing a non-binding resolution in 2015, the EU's only directly elected institution has supported the prohibition of commercial surrogacy on the grounds that it undermines the human dignity of women to treat her body and its reproductive functions as a commodity. While commenting upon the war's impact on women following Russia's Ukraine in February 22, the European Parliament acknowledged the special difficulties facing Ukrainian women, especially surrogate mothers, and the surrogate-born children unable to be cared for by their foreign intended parents, before once again condemning surrogacy as an institution for exploiting women for exposing women around the world to exploitation, in particular those who are poor and in situations of vulnerability. Okay, so I'm gonna try to speak a little quicker since the hour is late. So I just want to do two concessions to this charge of exploitation and commodification. So the first is that, yes, money does change things. So as I said in class today, if you guys have ever watched reality shows where there's like games where you do eat ridiculous things or jump out of airplanes or do things you would otherwise not do for the money, clearly money does change things, and we have to acknowledge that. The concern, of course, is that some people, if they're desperate for money, will minimize the risks to them, right? And because it'll be the lure of financial gain, right? So we have to be mindful of that. Now, having made this concession, something you should know that in the US, there is little evidence that the indigent are being recruited to become pregnant for others. This is because fertility clinics regularly screen out individuals on welfare or public assistance. A known correlation exists between poverty and poor health. So basically, underprivileged persons are not desirable surrogacy candidates because intended parents want healthy women to bear their children, okay? And also because IPs do not want to feel like they must support the surrogates financially. Now, of course, screening norms are going to vary from clinic to clinic and across countries, so what is generally true of the US may not hold everywhere. Okay, so the second concession that we have to make about fears about racial disparities is that we cannot conclusively verify or put to rest that surrogacy is perpetuating, racial disparities or tensions. This is because there are no federal or international reporting requirements. Fertility clinics, not on race or class, right? And fertility clinics will only selectively self-report the demographics of their clients. If you look at actual empirical studies on surrogates, though, in many Western countries, the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, white people are overrepresented on both sides, both as independent parents and surrogates. The data is not showing white people hiring women of color. Something I've also discussed, and I made an allusion here earlier, is that you also have really interesting phenomenon where China is now a leading sending country for surrogates. Mainland Chinese persons prefer to come to California and hire white American surrogates. You also, before the war, had Russia and Ukraine as top destinations. In Russia and Ukraine, you're mostly talking about white women, right? So you have foreign nationals of all sorts of nationalities hiring white women. So this is all to say that there may be knee-jerk concerns about racial dynamics, but the situation on the ground is going to be a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, so questioning why payment is invariably problematic. There's a lot I want to say here, and because I've already covered some of this material in Dr. Pei's class, if it's okay, I'm just going to talk through, abbreviate things, and then hopefully we can have a discussion. So the first is the idea that feminists will say self and other regarding behaviors can be compatible. That if you think of a good teacher, or a good doctor, or a lifeguard, or someone who does, search and rescue, very few people will say, you're only a doctor, you're only a teacher, you're only a lifeguard for the money. If it weren't for the money, you would have no care for your students. You would have no care for the drowning swimmer. You have no care for the people who are going to be burned alive in a firehouse, right? Most people would think it's appropriate that if you're in a helping profession and you're doing work, you should be compensated for that. For some reason, when we get to surrogacy and women are seeking compensation, people will say she's only doing it for the money. But if you look at what surrogates themselves report, they often report a combination of self and other regarding reasons. They will say, motherhood means a lot to me. I have deep compassion for people who are struggling. It's actually not that difficult for me to be pregnant. Hey, I could use some money. I can pay off my college loans. I can take the kids to Disneyland, whatever, right? So I think there's a fundamental, strange logic that is operating where we allow other people to have a mixture of motives, but for whatever reason, we're not so willing to allow surrogates to have that mixture. The second thing is to, again, trust women and avoid paternalism. This is a comment that I make, a larger principle that I discuss in my book. And this idea is that I do think it's possible for people to have informed consent to work in risky or hazardous conditions, or even to take jobs that are socially stigmatizing. So for instance, if you look at commercial fishing or logging, these are actually very, very dangerous jobs, right? The hazard rate is pretty high. There are jobs that some people say are socially undesirable, like janitorial services or house cleaning or various other service industry jobs. And I do believe people can consent to take them if they say, out of all of my options, this is the best one. So what I'm doing here, and I'm trying to speak a little bit more quickly, is that we see this in the case in some of the surrogacy literature. Some of it is mixed. In some cases, there is a failure of informed consent. So Miranda Davies, for instance, talks about some cases where women are being scheduled C-sections. They're doing that because IPs have to travel long distances, and they want to know, like, when do I have to show up, right, for the birth of my child? But some of these women are being told that the C-sections are in your best health. So they have access to high-quality maternal care, but folks are not acting in their best interests. But in other cases, you have women, and there's some researchers, there are people who've done research among women in Mumbai, New Delhi, and Chennai in 2013 and 2014. And these subjects have said that they actually prefer surrogacy work to wage-paid employment. Why? Because it paid better, it had better working conditions, because their previous jobs required them to work late, and it also had some other stigmatizing things. So again, this is all to say that the record can be mixed, but if you are prepared to say the only reason why poor people choose surrogacy, and thus they're not meeting the conditions of consent, you technically have to say they can't consent to anything then. They can't consent to being a janitor. They cannot consent to being a seamstress. They cannot consent to any other job, right? So again, if you're familiar with post-colonial feminist discourse, you see there's a lot of talk about stop thinking that these global South poor women need, saviors, right? They are assessing all of their life options, and for some people, surrogacy is actually their best option for them. Okay, moving on to the third, and here I'll be quick. So this is to avoid the tyranny of the gift. This phrase comes from the organ donation literature. So there are cases where one person gives their life-saving organ to another, usually a kidney, and this is a gift that can never be reciprocated, right? And so the person who's received the gift feels so indebted to them, and then there's really interesting and complicated dynamics that emerge. I explained to the class today and in my book that I think I had an experience of that. Again, Katie and Stephen did not pay me money, but every possible chance they could have given me a gift, like really random minor holidays like Labor Day and Arbor Day or whatever, they showed up with a gift because people, they want to be able to equalize the relationship, right? And so if you allow for financial compensation, that is one way where you can do that. The final point is about contextual fairness and justice. So as I said in class, In my case in California, I am the only one who was not paid in this arrangement with my friends. The reproductive endocrinologists were paid, the fertility clinic staff, the psychologists, the attorneys, everyone was paid. Now, of course, I had the right to be paid, but I wanted to give it as a gift. It would be very odd to me if, there are states that say this, that women cannot be paid for their labor, right? But maybe they allow for people to be compensated for their sperm donation or their blood plasma or whatever, right? So there are issues of fairness and justice. Okay, so to conclude, I have not in any way actually given you the argument for my book, right? So I've only really focused on just 3 questions, concerns that come up when folks are wondering if surrogacy is good or bad for women. What I do in the book is I make an argument based on progressive Christian commitments. These are things I shared with the class. I'm happy to elaborate on them in the Q&A. But after I make the argument, I still say, well, there are ways that surrogacy could go terribly wrong, right? So I'm offering some principles to help people do the collective discernment, to help guide, how do parents relate to the surrogate, how does the surrogate relate to the child, et cetera, how do other people relate to this group. In the end, my hope is that it will be a thing of beauty. So it definitely has been for me. Of course, things don't always work out, so I don't want to paint a romantic picture. But to the left is me with the intended mother prior to our induction. In the middle is me 3 months postpartum with my family. 7 years later, just a couple weeks ago, here are our 2 families. So my kids, they are playmates with their girl. We are bonded for life. So that's it. Thank you. I apologize for going a little bit long, but I am very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. All right. Yes.
So I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about.
Just shout.
Okay. I thought it was really interesting when you were talking about the transferal, like the making of the parents, how they get to witness that making the baby back over.
Yeah.
And so it reminded me of I'm taking an anthropology class called Human Origins. Taking an called Human Origins, and it's about human evolution, right? And so
Yeah.
we've been talking a lot about debates of altruism,
Yeah.
such as Richard Dawkins, who says that humans are not inherently altruistic, we're inherently selfish. And so I was connecting that to your topic of we talk about the quote, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
And so how we call it allo parenting. So I was wondering how you would respond to that. There's almost a necessity for others to be involved in the activity of mothering.
Yeah, that's right. So the goal, according to many surrogates and intended parents, is to offer what's been called a vicarious pregnancy. So it becomes a matter of discernment, but because you, as a surrogate, you don't want to overshare. You don't want to say so much, because especially if you're partnering with a woman, as we discussed in class, right? By the time they get to commissioning you as a surrogate, they will have had probably years of reproductive loss. So it is excruciating for them, for you to have these experiences. So maybe you're complaining about your swollen feet or whatever, and that can be painful. At the same time, that's part of pregnancy, right? So if you can bring her along. So what I did is every appointment, major one, Katie came with me. And every time there was an ultrasound, she would start speaking to her daughter. It was actually really beautiful to watch. right? So it's like she could start the bonding. It wasn't embodied, right? But she could start it along the way. With gay men, we talked about this in class too. When surrogates work with gay male couples, they tend to be pampered a lot, and they really, really like that. And the anecdotal experience is that there's a term called womb envy, and there are some surrogates who feel like some intended mothers can be a bit much. They're telling me, oh, I have to eat all organic. Oh, I can't use Windex on my windows because it'll be, I'll poison the body or whatever. But in the literature, gay men seem to be a little bit more chill about those types of things. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Okay. Any other questions?
Grace, you talked about the empirical studies that address the issue of psychological distress.
Yeah.
And they're overwhelmingly, show that there are problems, right? Are there similar empirical studies for the children?
There are.
And are they?
They're not.
positive?
They're not as long-ranging. I think we only have up to about early 20s. We don't have people in their 40s yet, 50s. And so that will be interesting to see. But the studies show that there are some adjustment difficulties at around age 7. And there's been a comparison to transracial adoptees. There's also some adjustment difficulties at around 7. And these tend to get resolved at around age 10. But unlike the case of donor-conceived children, surrogate-born children usually know that they were surrogate-conceived, right? So there's usually not that type of secrecy, right? And that actually goes to the point of better psychological outcomes.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks again for delivering wonderful lecture, and thank you all for coming to lecture this evening. If you have any personal question, you can come forward and then have a conversation with Dr. Gang.